Advice rarely enters a conversation as neutral data anymore, because the moment it appears, something else activates first. In a group, a room, or a private exchange, a simple correction changes posture before it changes understanding. Shoulders tighten, tone flattens, the reply shortens. Proverbs reports that the words of the reckless pierce like swords, and that image matters because it explains why advice now lands like violence instead of information. A comment meant to adjust behavior is heard as an attempt to dominate identity. This shift doesn't start with the speaker, it starts inside the listener. When advice touches a habit already fused with self-image, the mind scans for danger instead of meaning. The question is no longer whether the words are accurate, but whether they threaten status, control, or belonging. This is why a suggestion in a conversation often produces distance rather than dialogue. The listener isn't weighing content, they're protecting position. In feeds, private messages, and real rooms, advice collapses into offense because modern identity is built to be defended, not examined. Scripture treats wise speech as healing, yet healing requires exposure, and exposure feels unsafe when identity is fragile. So the response becomes avoidance. Replies go cold. Invitations stop. Silence replaces engagement. Over time, people learn that offering correction costs connection, so they withdraw first. The group adapts by removing friction, not error. Advice doesn't disappear because it's wrong, it disappears because it feels dangerous. This pressure intensifies because advice now arrives in environments trained to reward agreement and punish disruption. In a conversation thread or shared space, correction stands out immediately. The social temperature drops. Others go quiet. The exchange becomes unsafe. Past experiences reinforce this reflex. Correction once led to embarrassment, loss of standing, or exposure, so the nervous system learns speed over discernment. Advice is categorized as threat before it is understood. This changes how people speak. Tone becomes padded, language turns indirect, silence becomes strategy. When words risk being perceived as blades, restraint feels safer than honesty. Over time, groups fill with unchallenged habits and shared blind spots. No one pushes back. No one corrects course. The absence of advice is mistaken for peace. Scripture never calls this peace. It documents what follows. When healing words are avoided, reckless patterns continue without interruption. The environment feels calm, but it is unmanaged. The cost appears later, after distance hardens and trust decays. What looks new is repetition, because this reaction didn't begin with screens or modern language. It appears wherever identity becomes brittle under observation. Scripture records resistance to correction long before contemporary psychology named it. Across generations, the pattern holds. When people sense that advice might lower them, they reinterpret intent. A warning becomes disrespect. A suggestion becomes control. A question becomes accusation. This reaction spreads through groups. Once one person responds defensively, others learn. Silence becomes the safer move. In families, workplaces, and communities, no one wants to be the one whose words trigger withdrawal, so language softens until it disappears. Scripture notes that people hated knowledge not because it was false, but because it interfered. As correction fades, feedback loops collapse. People stop hearing how they're changing. Habits harden unnoticed. The group feels stable, but it's only unchallenged. In that environment, reckless caverns don't need loud voices. They survive through quiet agreement. When advice is framed as violence, the past repeats without resistance. Scripture doesn't argue this point, it observes it. People begin to avoid hearing anything that might cut. They stiffen and refuse to listen, not during chaos, but during ordinary life. The pattern isn't rebellion, it's selective hearing. Words that affirm identity are absorbed. Words that threaten it are rejected as unsafe. Over time, this creates blindness. Feedback stops landing. Behavior goes unchecked. When correction is despised, consequences follow without announcement. Healing words can't function where exposure is treated as danger, so the mind chooses comfort over clarity. The cost isn't immediate conflict, it's gradual misalignment with reality.
Once advice is filtered out, reality loses its correction mechanism. Behavior doesn't stop forming, it just stops being challenged. Conversations repeat, outcomes repeat. Proverbs' contrast between piercing and healing still applies, but now the piercing never occurs because words are withheld. Healing speech requires contact, and contact has been labeled unsafe. People misread the silence as stability. In groups, no one pushes back when decisions drift. In relationships, concerns remain unspoken. Confidence grows detached from accuracy. Small errors compound. Reckless patterns normalize. They don't announce themselves. The environment feels calm right until misalignment becomes visible. By then, escalation has already shaped identity. Being uncorrectable becomes proof of strength. Questions sound disrespectful. Feedback feels controlling. People defend choices they no longer remember choosing. Groups move faster, not wiser. Dissent disappears, not because agreement is real, but because friction has been punished. Silence signals loyalty. Advice signals threat. Scripture describes this as blindness, not ignorance. Eyes work, ears function, interpretation fails. Individuals feel stable while drifting. Groups feel united while decaying. Outcomes eventually surface and feel sudden, unfair, external. No one connects them to the long absence of correction. By this stage, damage doesn't look dramatic. It looks like normal life continuing uninterrupted. Conversations still happen, decisions still get made, but the corrective signal is gone. People remember the last time speaking cost them closeness, so they adapt. They wait for timing that never arrives. They joke instead of warn. They drop the subject. Scripture records people loving darkness over light, not because light was cruel, but because it revealed. Without correction, people calibrate against affirmation instead of reality. Agreement feels like safety. Peace is confused with health. The absence of tension is mistaken for unity. This is where collapse hides best. Nothing feels urgent. Nothing sounds wrong. Reckless patterns no longer need reckless words. They are sustained by the removal of healing ones. The final pattern is not collapse itself, but the inability to recognize it while it is happening. By the time consequences surface, the language to describe them has already been stripped away. Advice was removed first, correction followed, then awareness. Healing words still exist, but they cannot operate where all words are treated as blades. When outcomes finally break through, relationships fail without warning, groups fracture without a clear cause, and individuals insist no one ever spoke. Scripture leaves the listener inside that moment. Speaking became too dangerous long ago. Every warning sounded like attack, every correction felt like threat, so wisdom learned to stay silent. And once advice feels like an attack, the ending has already begun, even if nothing feels broken yet.